Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here, once again with another Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. In today's video, we'll be going over the Werewolf skill line in the Elder Scrolls Online, how it's used in the endgame performance of both PvE and PvP, as well as how to get it, and a few cool and interesting ways to use these. We'll kick things right off by explaining how to become a werewolf. In Elder Scrolls Online, there are 3 ways to become a werewolf. The first is to find rare NPCs in the old quote-unquote faction zones. So the final zones are tiers predating 1 Tamriel. Like, this doesn't apply anymore. Every zone is the same, but it still uses the same system. Bankerai is Daggerfall's final zone. Reaper's March is AD's final zone. And then the Rift is EP's final zone. So in these zones, there will be rare mobs, and they spawn every full moon. And in Elder Scrolls Online, I think there's like 3 days to every 1 human day, so it's about every week or so that they appear. And they're located, there's tons of guides online showing spawn locations, etc. But you can go there. When you engage with combat, do not kill them immediately. Wait until they attack you a little bit. You'll become inflicted. It'll be very obvious to tell what's happened. And then you'll have a disease on your bar under your active effects. And it won't be called lycanthropy at first. It'll be the infestation of, like, you're first inflicted with this disease. Then you'll be prompted to go start a quest. Before I explain what happens on that quest, there are 2 other ways to get inflicted with lycanthropy. The second way to become inflicted with lycanthropy is to have a player who already is a werewolf to bite you. There's a passive, which I'll discuss a little bit more later, that allows pre-existing werewolves to bite players every 7 days. It has a 7-day internal cooldown, meaning you can't do it again. But what you do is you go to one of the shrines, which again you can look up online. Daggerfall's, which anyone can use now, is in Bankerai. It's right here on the minimap. But you go there, they transform into a werewolf, you sit in front of the shrine, and then there will be a feed option for that player when they aim it at you, and then after they do it, you'll be knocked on the ground, and then you'll be inflicted. Now, completing both of these will then net you access to the Hircine quest, which will take you to the hunting grounds, which again, you'll interact with the shrine, you'll talk to Hircine, you'll accept his gift, or you'll deny it, and then you'll do some RP questing, which you can find out for yourself. It's really cool. It's a great way to see if you like werewolves, because when you go into the quest, you'll be permanently transformed, and you'll have access to skills, and you'll be able to get a feel of how a werewolf plays. Once you finish the quest, then you will lose access to these skills, and you will be reverted to a level 1 werewolf, and then you'll have to generate experience as a werewolf in order to raise that, and that'll unlock passives, abilities, etc. But again, so those 2 ways require you to do a quest, and then after you do the quest, it'll reset you. Then the third option is to spend real-life money in the Crown Store. And if we go to the Crown Store and go to upgrades, under skill lines, you can buy a vampire bite or a werewolf bite. Buying the werewolf bite will merely transform you for a brief moment, and then you'll unlock it. And then you can go do the quest if you want. Otherwise, you can just start generating experience right off the bat. So the way to generate werewolf XP is while you are transformed as a werewolf, which is an ultimate, not a passive, not an ability, not something of the sort. You have to have the ultimate slotted, you activate it, and then you become a werewolf, and then you get kills while as a werewolf. Now, any kill will do. You can kill critters, you can kill mobs with 1 HP, you can kill civilians, you can kill bosses. It does not matter. 1 kill is 1 kill. They all give the same amount of experience. You don't need to drink acidic ambrosia, etc. So once you do that, you'll start gaining new powers in the form of abilities and passives. And then it'll go from 1 to 10. It's really, really easy to do. You can easily go from 1 to 10 in less than 3 hours if you're doing it properly. I'm sure you could even do it in an hour, but really straightforward. So now that you know how to become a werewolf, let's explain what happens as a werewolf. So right off the bat, you'll be inflicted with lycanthropy, which is the final stage of werewolfism. This will not advance like vampire, nothing will happen. And the other great thing about this will not afflict you or quote-unquote debuff you while you are out of werewolf form. So if you don't like having negative effects afflicting your character all the time, but you still want to have a cool access to an ultimate for RP or DPS or whatever it is, then lycanthropy is awesome because you don't have the negative afflictions or buffs while you are in your humanoid form. The only time we see negative effects to our character is when we are a werewolf. And what happens is when we're a werewolf, we're going to take 25% more damage from poison attacks. So in PvE, this isn't a big deal. Poison as a damage source, as incoming damage, is non-existent. There are very few times, other than Sanctum Ophidia, where poison will be devastating. And furthermore, lycanthropy gives an insane amount of stamina, armor, and sprinting speed. So when we're in form, we might take more damage from poison damage, but we have so much armor and spell resistance that it's okay in PvE, because we're going to be at hard cap while we're in form, meaning we're going to take 50% less damage without CP, without damage reduction, etc. It's just going to be from our base armor and spell resistance. Furthermore, you can increase your specific poison resistance with the Hardy champion point node in the champion point system. This will reduce poison damage up to 25%. Hey, guess what? You just negated Werewolf's debuff. So that's about it. And then the other thing is in PvP, this is going to be slightly more punishing because lethal arrow, poison injection, poisons, like all of these damage sources, Viper Sting, they do a lot of damage. They hurt. So if you're a werewolf, it's gonna fucking hurt even more. So you have to be careful as a werewolf in Cyrodiil. If you're fighting stamina builds, especially Nightblades or bow users, they're going to be your bane of existence. So you're going to want to either kill them before they can do anything to you or steer clear of them. Or just don't enter a werewolf form, because remember, if you're not in form, you don't take these negative effects. And then the final thing that's going to happen with lycanthropy is while you are transformed as a werewolf, you will be treated as a Daedric entity. And the implications that come with that come from Fighter's Guild. So anytime someone uses Fighter's Guild abilities against you, they're going to deal 20% more damage. That means rearming Trap, Silver Leash and its morphs, and Dawnbreaker of Smiting especially are going to do hella high damage. Dawnbreaker of Smiting will probably devastate you in ways you've never seen before. Like, vampires and werewolves really feel these skills when they're in the form, because they're already good skills in Cyrodiil. And then furthermore, if you are weak to them, they're going to do even more. So again, if you're fighting people and you see them using Dawnbreaker of Smiting, probably a good idea to not enter a werewolf to go fight them, unless you can kill them before they do anything. But now that all of that good stuff is explained, let's go over the meat and bones of Werewolf, our ultimate ability. And the reason we're explaining the ultimate first is because this is what is unlocked first. You cannot use active abilities unless you are in your werewolf form. I have them on my bar here just to demonstrate their power in terms of looking at their tooltip, but I cannot use them. Like, if I try to use them on a skeleton, it tells me must be in werewolf form. So again, you have to be in your werewolf form, and that's why I'm explaining the ultimate first. But what it is it costs a disgusting 325 ultimate, so you have to generate a lot before you use this. But what happens is what you transform after you activate it, and it lasts 30 seconds. And while you are a werewolf, you get the juicy armor and spell resistance, meaning taking less damage. You sprint way faster, and then you have bonus like stamina and weapon damage and stuff. So you're going to have a really high stamina pool. Furthermore, as soon as you transform as a werewolf, 3 nearby enemies will be feared for 4 seconds. So in PvP, this is awesome because you can catch people off guard if you instantly pop as a werewolf and you're not a Nightblade, because most people aren't going to be expecting fear, and fear is probably one of the most devastating forms of crowd control in Cyrodiil because it drops block and it's a very subtle indicator of before it goes off. So if someone walks in and they're not a Nightblade, you're probably laughing at them because you're like, oh, you're gonna die. And then all of a sudden this giant wolf is in front of you and you're running away in terror. So that bonus ability in Cyrodiil is going to be great. In PvE, not so much, because fearing enemies is going to make them run out of your ground AoEs. They're going to run around like headless chickens, making you have to follow them and lose DPS. So in PvE, not a big deal. Luckily, bosses will not be feared, so in like min-max application, that can be ignored. But while we're a werewolf, our light and heavy attacks are going to be augmented to do additional damage, and furthermore, they will afflict bleeds every time we light attack. So every time we light attack, we cause an enemy to bleed for X amount of physical damage over 8 seconds. And then we see here, our physical and spell resistance is increased by 10k. This will go up if I'm in gear, CP, etc. It's very easy to hit hard cap, as I've said, which is 33,000 spell and physical resistance, meaning 50% less damage. So that's going to be really, really helpful. But at the same time, it's going to be really, really useless because the meta of endgame PvE revolves around you doing true damage. We already have Sharpened, Alkosh, Night Mothers, Twin Fang. We have so much armor penetration that attacks that ignore armor are wasted because we're already ignoring it anyway, so there's no real added gain here. I'd like to see something else happen with bleeds where if an enemy already has 0 armor, that it afflicts additional damage or triggers a debuff or something cool to add a little bit more dynamic gameplay and allow for specialization of like, alright, well, my job is to make sure that the enemy has no armor so we can get the true effects of this. But again, that's not going to happen. And in PvE, that's going to be rather negligible. In PvP, it'll be kind of a big deal, especially with tanks. Tanks permablocking, bleeds are going to do a lot of damage to them, so that's going to be very helpful. And then the final thing with this ultimate is simply having it slotted will net you 15% bonus stamina recovery. This isn't a lot, it's a little bit, it helps, but recovery is now additive instead of multiplicative, meaning we're going to get a very, very small amount of stamina regen because we don't run high stam regen as a DPS build. In PvP, it'll be a lot of stam regen because we're running drinks, we're running regen enchants, we're running gear sets, because you have to dodge roll, you have to take care of yourself. There's no healer throwing shards, bodies to repent all the time. So stam recovery in PvP, gonna be way more beneficial. In PvE, not so much. Now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Pack Leader. And what that's going to do is while we're a werewolf, we're going to summon 2 wolf bros to come to our side and help us kick some ass. They're going to last the entire 30-second duration, and furthermore, if they're killed, they will return after 16 seconds. Meaning you can have them up permanently or 50% of the time. So if they get killed right away, you're at least granted the fact that they're going to come back at roughly the halfway mark of when your werewolf will fall off. Otherwise, they'll be there. They do some decent damage, but since they operate as pets, they will not inherit critical hit damage, nor will they inherit champion point allocations. If those 2 things got fixed, this morph would be a little bit stronger, and pets in general would feel a lot more impactful. But now we'll look at our other morph, and that is Werewolf Berserker, which increases the damage of our light attack bleeds. And it's quite a sizable amount. We have 1880 on the base and then 2635 on the morph, meaning it's going to have additional coefficients. So this means if you're going a full damage build, take Werewolf Berserker. It's going to really, really help out. If you're going tanky or you like PvP, then Pack Leader is going to be an option too, because it's going to have 2 more adds. That means enemies are going to attack the adds instead of your allies, and you're going to gain some like distraction in terms of like, oh, in PvP sometimes it's hard to target people, so they might hit a wolf, use a meteor on a wolf instead of you, or use that snipe on your buddy instead of you. So it doesn't have a true value, but it does have that added variability to the field where it's like there's so much going on that it makes it much harder to just target you and nuke you. So that there is an option there, but usually I like Werewolf Berserker. Now we'll look at our active abilities, and our first is Pounce, and Pounce is going to cost a buttload of stamina. This is without cost reduction or anything. In werewolf form, it will not receive cost reductions either, but it will look at CP, gear, etc. It can be casted the same way as a gap closer would, meaning 5 to 22 meters. It has a minimum, so you have to be at least 5 meters away, and you can not be further than 22 meters away. But all you're going to do is you're going to leap to that target, dealing physical damage, and then if that enemy was already off balance, you will stun them for 2 seconds. So if someone is sitting in Lightning Wall, which applies off balance, if a DK is using Molten Whip or Power Lash that sets enemies off balance, etc. There are tons of ways to set enemies off balance. So Pounce is going to stun a lot in PvP. In PvE, not so much, because most of the time we'll be fighting enemies that are immune to CC, so rather lackluster, not going to really do anything. And now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Brutal Pounce. And what Brutal Pounce is going to do is it's going to add an AoE splash damage mechanic to the leap. So what happens is it gains a 5 meters AoE radius, and anything within 5 meters of your initial casted target will take the initial hit damage that the leap does. So it just multiplies it. It has no AoE cap. It's just as many people as you can clump in that little radius. It is rather small, however, so in terms of like cleave DPS, this isn't that important, and plus this skill is a gap closer, so we're not going to be using it that often. The only time we'll be using it is in Cyrodiil, and that's to set people that are already off balance to be stunned. And then gap closers are much more efficient in Cyrodiil because mobility is very important, but in PvE, not going to really matter what morph we take with this. And the extra splash damage doesn't really do anything. The other thing to note is that this splash damage will also hit to your initial hit target. So it doubles the damage of the gap closer because the AoE operates as a second entity or a second damage calculation. So the initial hit will see a ×2, and then the others will just have a ×1. So it does have that added DPS benefit, but again, in PvE, not really going to be using a gap closer. Our other morph is called Feral Pounce, and what that does is anytime you use the skill up to 10 meters away, you add it 1 additional second to your werewolf transformer. Again, not really that amazing. Usually we're going to go for the DPS morph in Cyrodiil just because more burst damage is very important, but having additional time to your werewolf timer is something that can't really be quantified in terms of additional DPS. In Cyrodiil, it can be bad because that means another second of 25% additional poison attacks and 20% from Fighter's Guild abilities, so it's kind of a blessing and a curse, so you have to be careful. Do you really want to stay in werewolf longer? But in PvE, if we're going for DPS and we're trying to do as much damage as a werewolf as possible, then we want to stay in werewolf as long as possible. So this is the morph I usually take for PvE, just because we're not going to be using a gap closer as much, but in fights where there is mobility and stuff, it's nice to gain a little bit of extra time in werewolf form. But again, in PvE, overall werewolf is kind of right now. It needs a lot of love in terms of stamina management and just unique damage. It has a lot of fantastic burst, but PvE isn't about burst, it's about sustain. In PvP, however, burst is amazing, so Werewolf can do a lot of damage in a short amount of time, so we're going to take Brutal Pounce if we're going the more PvP route. Our next ability is called Hircine's Bounty, and it is going to be a self-heal. It's going to cost Magicka, but it should be noted that Hircine's Bounty will scale with power. And what that means is it's not going to look at weapon damage, it's not going to look at spell damage, health, Magicka stamina. What it means is it's going to look at the weapon power or damage that these weapons give you. So to put that in perspective, My power from dual wield is 1335 on my main hand, and then it's going to be half of my offhand. And that's going to be a little bit steeper. I don't know the exact math on it now, due to the changes of dual wield from Homestead. But if we look at dual wield expert, it's going to increase the weapon damage of my offhand. So it's not going to increase the power, but we'll just look. Here I have 2481 weapon damage, and my tooltip for Hircine's Bounty is 6047. And if I pump up dual wield expert, I now jump to 2561 weapon damage, but I still persist at 6047 health. However, when my weapon damage here, or my power, is 2561, and I swap to my bow, which has a lesser power, it's going to drop to 2442. And then my heal is going to drop to 5432. And that's not because of percent amps, not because damage or anything. It's because the power of my weapon is changing. So that's the big thing. Again, like I can even drink a weapon power potion, get 20% more weapon damage. I have 3k, but Hircine's Bounty doesn't change. And because it scales with power, which is a unique stat that is only granted from weapons in very, very rare item sets in the game, or enchants. So power is a very powerful stat, as the name would imply, but it's not readily accessible, and that's what Hircine's Bounty is going to scale with. So in realisticness, it's not going to scale with anything available to us other than making sure we have gold weapons and then percent healing done and received. It's very, very straightforward. It is an instant cast. It restores health as soon as you use it. Nothing else. Really, really straightforward. Just helps the werewolf get some additional healing because we can't use like Alliance War skills while in werewolf. So we're going to need to heal ourselves in werewolf form. Our morphs are Hircine's Rage, which increases our weapon damage by 10% for 17 seconds. This is the morph that I like, and that's because this 10% weapon damage you gain stacks with all other weapon damage amplifications in the game. This is not a major or a minor buff. So if we're going for damage, Hircine's Rage is going to give a lot of it, because that 10% weapon damage is going to stack with major minor brutality, it's going to stack with medium armor, it's going to stack with passives, it's going to be very, very strong. And in werewolf, since we want burst, and this is a more of a PvP aspect, weapon damage is very important because it increases our damage, it increases our healing, so that is going to be very, very nice. Our other morph, on the other hand, is called Hircine's Fortitude, which adds an additional heal over time that lasts 8 seconds and does roughly half the heal that the initial heal does. This will heal every 2 seconds as opposed to 1, so you'll get 4 damage, or 4 heal over time ticks plus the initial heal tick. So in total, you'll get 5. Pretty straightforward. This is the more self-preservation morph. Still, I really, really prefer Hircine's Rage because werewolf is all about damage. So usually what I'll do is I'll enter werewolf form and immediately use Hircine's Rage to bolster my weapon damage to get much more DPS out of my werewolf transformation. The other really, really awesome thing about Hircine's Rage is you can cast it right before werewolf ends and it will persist in your humanoid form, so you'll gain some extra weapon damage after you leave. This makes werewolf really, really interesting, and I wish that it would be emphasized a little bit more, going in and out of werewolf form and carrying boons in and out, making it so it was a state of transformation that you managed in and out of rather than all in or all out. So I love this gameplay element. It's really cool because it's like, all right, I'm going to go in werewolf form, get a bunch of damage, and then I'm going to try and retain as many buffs out of it and then go back in and like balance human and werewolf. So if we saw more of this, I think werewolf would be a much stronger option if it like drained ultimate, like overload, like the longer you were in it, the more it drained. So it became this something that you managed rather than you activated. I would really like that. But yeah, Hircine's Rage is going to be my suggested morph just because it's going to increase our damage, increase our defensive or our offensive capabilities. But it will not increase the healing done by this skill. So if you want more self-preservation, then we're going to go with Hircine's Fortitude. Our next ability is called Roar, and Roar is not going to scale with any stats because it costs stamina, but it doesn't do damage. What it does is it fears up to 3 nearby enemies, and then it will set them off balance for 3.5 seconds. So the really nice thing is that fear is a very strong tool. It drops block. We talked about this earlier with while we transform into werewolf. Fear is really, really strong because it's deceptive. It's hard to look for. There's no telegraph, meaning there's no indicator that it's happening. It just happens. It drops block. It makes you run around. It forces you to CC break, and if you don't, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And furthermore, since it sets you off balance, that means you can be heavy attacked, which will knock you down and deal additional damage. It will open up further calculations, so abilities that deal additional damage to off-balance targets like Flame Lash or one of our other abilities. And finally, the most important thing is that it's going to activate the Exploiter passive in the Ritual Tree. Exploiter increases your damage against off-balance enemies by 10%. So this right here, this skill is going to be very, very strong in prepping damage. It's not going to do damage, but it's going to prepare it. So you can line this up, you can get this ready, and then hit an enemy right after for tons and tons of damage. So a very deceptive tool, but it has to be used prior instead of just instantly gaining benefit from. It'll have a 1-second cast time. This cannot be interrupted as far as I'm aware since it costs stamina. If I'm wrong, please drop a comment in, let me know. But I've never seen this bashed, so I'm not sure. It has an 8 meters AoE radius, so any enemy up to 3 in 8 meters of your target position, which will be you because it casts from you, not an area, will be feared and then set off balance for the 3.3 second duration. Really, really strong tool when used properly. And now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Ferocious Roar. And what that's going to do is if an enemy is killed while they are feared, the other enemies that are nearby them will be disoriented and set off balance for 2.5 seconds. So this is the sort of thing where it's further activating or playing into that preparation aspect where it's like, all right, I'm going to fear 5 nearby enemies. I'm going to fear 3 of them, and then I'm going to focus fire on 1. I'm going to blow him up, do tons of damage because he's off balance, hit him with a heavy attack, whatever. Now that he's dead, now those 2 allies of his that didn't get feared will be disoriented and then set off balance. So disorient means that they'll be stunned, but if they take damage, it will break. But even if they do break that, they will still be off balance for the 2.5 seconds, meaning they're going to take additional damage. And while this morph doesn't seem like it's going to do a whole lot, when we look at one of our spammable morphs, this is going to be a very, very strong tool when used properly. This is my suggestion for the PvP morph. I'll explain a little bit why after we look at our other morph, and then even in PvE it can be used. Just the only issue with it is that since mobs or elites that are immune to CC can't be feared, it's going to be really lackluster in end game performance. But in like dungeons and stuff where targets can be feared, it's going to do a lot of damage if you like the werewolf gameplay element. But now we'll look at our other morph, and that is Rousing Roar. And what that's going to do is it's going to grant major brutality to you and up to 5 other nearby allies, just increasing your weapon damage by 20% for 20 seconds. Now this seems like it's fantastic and great and all, but major brutality is relatively easy to gain access to. It's on potions, it's on igneous weapons, it's on a bunch of other stuff. So there are tons and tons and tons of ways to gain major brutality. So this isn't going to really give us anything mandatory. It's not going to offer us a unique gameplay element that we can access. Like Rousing or Ferocious Roar, it's going to give a bunch of damage in the form of off balance, it's going to fear, it's going to disorient, it's going to do a lot, and it's going to enable a lot of mechanics that the player can utilize versus just granting major brutality, which seems really nice, but again, as a werewolf, we can use potions, we can be affected by buffs, so if there's a DK using Igneous, or we're a Sork and we use Crit Surge before we enter, then this isn't going to give us anything. And furthermore, most of our allies who have major brutality are going to be giving it to themselves already in the same ways that we would, so I don't like this morph. Maybe if it's stacked or was unique, then it would be really, really nice for the more DPS, like, alright, let's have a werewolf pack and one person uses Rousing Roar and he gives the rest of the team 17% weapon damage that stacks, or something of the sort. That would be cool. But as it stands, not that great, don't like it. Much prefer Ferocious Roar for setting up that big burst damage. Our next ability is called Piercing Howl, and Piercing Howl is the main spammable of the werewolf. It's going to scale with our max stamina, weapon damage, armor penetration, and weapon critical, as it deals physical damage. That means it will also scale with the mighty node in the champion point system. All it does is you roar in the enemy's face, call him a bitch or something, and then deal some hefty physical damage, and then furthermore you will stun them for 3 seconds. So in PvP, really nice. It's going to do burst damage and it's going to stun. A very strong spammable. In PvE, that burst damage is going to be important. The stun is going to be rather lackluster because, again, most of the time we'll be fighting enemies that are really tough, immune to crowd control, so that's not going to give us anything. It has a 10 meters range, so it can be casted up to 10 meters away, but it will require a target. So it's not something you just cast and it's a conal, it will be a single target attack. So it requires a target, but it can be casted up to 10 meters away, meaning you have the option to like go in and out of comp or melee range. You don't have to sit right on the boss. You can back off a little bit. So really strong in and of itself for both PvE and in PvP. My only complaint with this is that it has a very high stamina cost. Biggest issue with Werewolf is that you cannot activate synergies. In this game, synergies are how you sustain shards, orbs, undaunted metal. All of these things that give you resources and benefits while activating, you cannot do. So, being unable to synergize that shard every 20 seconds, getting 25% of your stamina, is going to be very detrimental to our performance in terms of sustained DPS. And this is ultimately going to be the killer of why Werewolf isn't meta in PvE. In PvP, luckily, a lot of stuff is about burst. We don't have to worry as much about sustain because we're going to be running regen enchants, etc. It's not all about min-maxing damage, it's about lining up burst, so that's not going to be as big of an issue there. But now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Howl of Despair. And what that's going to do is anytime we use this ability, we will grant our allies the option to activate Feeding Frenzy, which is a synergy. Activating it will increase their and all further allies' light and heavy attack damage by 10% for 15 seconds. So this is going to enable for a lot of raid DPS because light and heavy attacks are very important. They don't seem like they make up a lot of our DPS, but most endgame builds have light or heavy attacks equaling roughly 10 to 15% of their overall DPS. So increasing that by an additional 10% is a really nice boon, and it offers something unique. It offers something to the raid that goes above and beyond. So even if you operate at a deficit, at least there's something there that you're giving back to your raid. So this is one thing that I really like about Werewolf, that it isn't just me, it isn't greedy. So it can suffer that less DPS. Like a werewolf could pull 2k less DPS than a stamina Nightblade or something of the sort. But since he has this option to give something unique in the form of Feeding Frenzy, that means that he's going to enable group DPS, possibly overturning that 2k. Like if I activate Feeding Frenzy and then I increase my allies' light and heavy attack damage, and that equals 3k bonus DPS for the 8 DPS in group, that is now a 1k gain over my 2k deficit versus running some other class. So that's going to be a really nice aspect of what I like. So this is something I take for group application. Our other morph, on the other hand, is going to be more greedy. And what that's going to do is it's going to deal 30% additional damage to enemies that are feared. So that spammable that already does a crap ton of damage where you're yelling in someone's face, if they're feared already, it's going to do 30% more. So in PvP, remember, burst is king. We want as much damage as possible in a short amount of time. So what's going to be very strong? Remember, we talked about it earlier, Ferocious Roar. It's going to fear an enemy and set them off balance. We line that immediately up with Howl of Agony, and boom! 9 times out of 10, the person you just did that will be on the floor, either dead or crying in pain. So this is going to be an extremely strong tool in Cyrodiil, as well as a more greedy option for PvE DPS, because even if an enemy cannot be feared, they will still be quote-unquote afflicted with it, so they won't be running around and stuff, but they will still take the additional 30% damage. So this is a very, very strong tool. It will not work on supermassive bosses, but bosses like Hyath or more humanoid stuff. So in Dragonstar Arena, Howl of Agony is going to be our go-to morph because it's going to increase our total damage, enabling for burst DPS. So in 4-man dungeons like DSA or hard modes and stuff, this is going to be a great tool because the light and heavy attack damage is only going to go to 1 other DPS versus in a raid where it would go to 7 other DPS. So Howl of Agony is what I like for PvP and solo performance, Howl of Despair for group play. Both really, really great morphs. Our last ability is called Infectious Claws, and Infectious Claws is going to be a damage over time function, and furthermore it will be an AoE one at that. What it does is it'll scale off of our max stamina, weapon damage, weapon critical, and armor penetration, because it will deal physical and then disease damage. So it has 2 damage components, the initial hit, and then if the initial hit lands, it will apply a damage over time effect that deals disease damage. It operates the same way as Carve does. So if you know the 2-handed skill Carve, it has a 7 meters AoE radius in terms of our cone, so it'll hit 7 meters in front of us from left to right, and then it'll go about 8 meters out. So it'll hit quite a few targets as long as we're aiming it properly, and then it's going to add in some cleave damage. So really, really strong tool. The damage over time is quite powerful. And furthermore, in PvP, since it's disease damage, that's going to be a chance to inflict Major Defile, decreasing healing received to enemies that it's on. And since it's a damage over time, it'll tick quite often, so it'll have a chance to apply Major Defile. Now, will it be up 100%? No, because there's a percent chance for it to proc. So sometimes it'll be up a lot, sometimes it won't be, but still, it's an option, it's there, and it's very, very strong in PvP. And then in PvE, since it's a dot, we're going to want to keep it up at least once every 10 seconds because that's how long it lasts. It deals damage in 2-second intervals, meaning there will be 5 damage ticks over the dot duration, and then there'll be an initial hit, so 6 damage sources overall. Now we'll look at our morphs. And our first morph is called Claws of Anguish. And remember how we talked about disease having a chance to apply to file? Well, now Claws of Anguish automatically applies to file, so we don't have to worry about a proc chance on the secondary effect of disease damage. We'll guaranteed have it for the 10-second duration. So it lasts just as long as the damage over time function. It can be purged, however, so keep that in mind if you're fighting a Templar. Unless you're able to really, really drain their resources, 9 times out of 10, they're just going to pop up Purify and get it done with. But if you're not fighting Templars or you're fighting a stamina build, this is going to be a very, very strong tool in Cyrodiil because Major Defile going to mean less healing done, meaning more chance to kill the enemy. In PvE, this isn't going to really do anything because mobs usually don't heal, and if they do, they can be bashed. So we don't need Major Defile in PvE. We have other options, so not going to really take this morph. Our other morph is called Claws of Life, which is going to heal you for a percent of the damage you deal. So, in PvP, this will also be an option if we want the more self-sustain. If we want to make sure we're healing and stuff and we don't want to stop to cast Tyrcine's Bounty, we can run Claws of Life, which is going to heal for 50% of the damage every time the damage over time function ticks. That means it'll have 5 heals from its component. It's going to scale with the same stats that the skill does, and it will furthermore scale with percent healing done and received. Really straightforward. This is the morph I take for PvE just to help our healing, and since our other morph doesn't add any damage, And then in PvP, it's an option. If you want to kill those healers and you don't want them healing, take Claws of Anguish. If you want to be the one who's healing and you want to be hard to kill, take Claws of Life. The really nice thing about Claws of Life is since this is an AoE, it will apply to multiple targets, so the heal over time will hit multiple times based on how many. So if I hit 5 enemies, that's 5 heal ticks every 2 seconds. Very, very strong. Now we'll look at our passive abilities, and our first passive ability is called Pursuit, and that's going to increase the stamina return that our heavy attacks restore by 100%. So the way that heavy attacks work is a fully charged heavy attack nets you 5% of your maximum resource depending on the weapon type. So stamina weapons like bows, swords, daggers, sword and shield, all that stuff, those are going to give stamina back. But if you use a staff, such as a destruction staff or a restoration staff, you'll get magicka back, and you're going to get 5%. Since we're a werewolf, that's going to be considered our fists, and that gives stamina back, so we're going to get 5% of our stam, and this increases it by 100%, meaning we'll get 10% of our stamina back when we heavy attack. So this is going to really help the werewolf return some of its resources. It's going to do a lot of damage. I'll demonstrate a little bit later how this looks. Werewolf heavy attacking is actually one of my favorite heavy attacks in the game. I usually hate heavy attacking because it feels clunky, it doesn't feel rewarding, but with Werewolf, I'll explain some cool tools on how to make up for that loss of the 2-second global we give up. But pretty straightforward passive, wouldn't change much with it. If anything, I might add a little bit of cost reduction for our werewolf skills just to help us out in the terms of sustained department. Or furthermore, if we didn't do that, if we just let werewolves synergize in the form, like if I could hit a shards or an orbs or a radiate, then that would all be okay, because I'd be getting stamina back from group play in the form of Undaunted Command, I'd be getting stuff from champion points, etc. So if that happened, then we wouldn't need to change anything with the passive. Our next passive is called Devour, and what that's going to do is anytime there's a corpse next to us on the battlefield, we will be given the prompt to synergize it or eat it, which will eat it. And this is the reason why we can't synergize abilities, is because our synergy function is called Devour. And that means we're going to eat the corpse of an enemy, and then we're going to get 12 additional seconds to our werewolf timer, allowing us to stick in form much longer. Now, at first glance, this seems awesome. It's like, okay, now I can stay in werewolf and be a complete fucking badass for 12 more seconds. Woohoo! But the biggest issue with this is that it takes 3 seconds to eat a corpse. You have to go down on all fours, stuff your face in with blood, rip them to shreds, and do, like, it's a cool animation, but it's wasting time. And in essence, that's wasting DPS. So in PvE endgame, Devour is going to be useless to us because it's going to make us come out of combat for 3 seconds, meaning we're not dealing damage. We're wasting 3 global cooldowns where we could have done Howl Weave, Howl Weave, Howl Weave, missing tons and tons of damage. So what do we do to fix that? We make Devour animation cancelable. I hit the synergy, I hold block, I get the effect. Or I can sit there, and if I don't want to animation cancel and I want to RP or I want to look cool, then I can watch the animation. But there needs to be an option to animation cancel it. Furthermore, I would really like to see a little bit of health and stamina return when we Devour, like 10% of our resources after we Devour. That would be really cool. But again, that's fluff. The only thing we need to do with this is make it animation cancelable. Let me hold block. I don't want to stuff my face in the middle of combat. There are more pressing matters when I need to kill a boss than eat. So that's the biggest issue. This is ultimately going to be why werewolves will not be in endgame PvE content. Our next passive ability is called Blood Rage, and what that's going to do is every time we take damage, we are going to increase the werewolf transformation duration by 3 seconds. This can only happen every 3 seconds. So in essence, as long as we're taking damage, we're extending the duration of werewolf by 1 second. No, you cannot indefinitely keep up werewolf, but you can still keep it up much longer than the 30 seconds if you are constantly taking pressure. In PvP, that's great because we're always going to be attacked. In PvE, not so great because we're not constantly taking damage, and if we were, we would die. So Blood Rage, again, going to be a very big reason why werewolves are not just bringing it to the table in PvE sustained DPS, because again, endgame performance is all about sustain. Being able to fight toe-to-toe for 5+ minutes in a fight. Fighting for 10 seconds, 30 seconds, and then falling out and losing all of your resources or damage, not good. So, again, just a very big reason why werewolves aren't at the table with the big boys in stamina DPS. Our next passive is called Blood Moon, and that's the passive I was talking about. This allows you to bite another player who is not already a werewolf or a vampire, and then they'll be initiated as a werewolf, so they'll be able to start the quest. This has a 7-day cooldown, so you can only do it once per week. It will look at the hour, so it's not like a daily reset thing. So just keep that in mind. If you bite someone, mark down the time, and then you'll know a week from that moment you'll be able to bite again. Really helpful. You can make some money off of it because people do buy werewolf bites. They're not really that expensive, though, and most of the time they're really easy to get, so it's better if you just give it away. Have some more people join the club, sort of thing. But in terms of application, we don't need this passive. This is an option where if we want to help people out, it's an option. But it'll use up a skill point, and if you're not into the group aspect of the MMO, then you don't need this passive. Our next passive ability is called Savage Strength, and what happens is while we are in our werewolf form, we're just going to gain a free 18% weapon damage. As simple as that. So just a bunch of free damage. 18% weapon damage in werewolf form is going to be very, very strong because weapon damage scales extremely powerfully with our abilities here. So most endgame builds revolve around crit, armor pen, all of this crazy stuff. Werewolves are more about weapon damage. So Savage Strength is going to further amplify. It's going to be a reason why we focus a little bit more on weapon damage, and it's going to stack. So remember, Hircine's Rage, that's 10%. Savage Strength, that's 18%. Major Minor Brutality added, that's 25%. So we're getting lots and lots of extra weapon damage, so we can get crazy high weapon damage. And in Cyrodiil, what does everyone love for some reason? Weapon damage. So if you like having really high weapon damage and thinking you're going to be effective, then Werewolf is an option. Does it mean you're going to be effective? Not so much. But still, weapon damage is a very strong stat for werewolves. Just don't focus completely on it. Crit is still important. Armor penetration is still important. Stamina still just as important. So don't get all rosy-eyed over the weapon damage. Don't min-max around it. But it is a nice boost. It helps DPS, and it also will help our healing. So in the form of Claws of Life. So really, really straightforward and very powerful when used. Just don't focus on it. Our last passive is called Call of the Pack. And what that's going to do is it's going to reduce the cost of remaining in your werewolf transformation by 20% for each transformed werewolf in the group, up to 80%. So what this does is it just makes it easier to maintain your werewolf transformation if you have multiple people or multiple werewolves in the group. So the way to make use out of this is you have to be in werewolf form for you and your allies to gain effect. Being out of it will do nothing. So you have to have active werewolf users, not just partied with them. So if you really like the staying power of werewolf and you want to group play as that, then have multiple people run werewolf. It's a lot of fun, but is it meta? At the end of the day, what is this series about? It's talking about the endgame performance. Is this something we can do in endgame? Can we do it in trials? Can we do it in super hard dungeons? The answer is no. Sadly, werewolf, again,
big reasons why. It lacks the sustained DPS. It focuses too much on burst. We're just going to lose so much power from Werewolf in terms of min-max application that we're not going to be able to make up for it. We're not going to be able to stay in it. If we want to stay in it, we have to waste 3 seconds to gain additional timers. Sustain is really, really brutal because we can't activate synergies. And furthermore, while we're a werewolf, we can't generate ultimate because we're in our werewolf form. So we're not going to be able to go in werewolf, get a 300 ultimate, leave werewolf, and enter again. We're going to have to wait until we leave. So the biggest suggestions I have for ZeniMax that I would love to see happen with werewolf is allow us to use synergies in werewolf form. That's one of the biggest ones, but the absolute biggest is do not have werewolf be a once cast ultimate. Have it be a form that you maintain. Have it drain ultimate instead of something that you just, oh, I cast it, it consumes all of it. Have it be a form where I enter, I leave. I enter, I leave. Have buffs persist in and out. Make it feel like it's a transformation that you want to maintain but also want to leave. Like either have stacking debuffs where the longer you're in werewolf, the more damage you take. So sometimes you want to come out, let that fall off, get your resources back, and then go back in. This would just really breathe life to it in terms of endgame performance. It would make it much more interesting, and it would make it much more skill-oriented. So at the end of the day, those are the aspects that I'd really, really like to see. Mainly the one about werewolf transformation with having it drain instead of consume ultimate. And then just the little things like needing to be able to synergize, let Devour be animation cancelable, etc. Just those small things would totally help Werewolf and bring it back to the big boys in PvE application. In PvP, Werewolf is devastating when used properly. So, like, I'm talking all this shit against Werewolf in PvE. A lot of this isn't an issue in PvP because they're two different worlds. Burst damage is more important. Sustain is much more manageable because we're having more stats like regen and drink and stuff. So though a lot of these flaws with it aren't going to afflict it. Yes, they'll still be there, and yes, Werewolf is not the undying juggernaut that Vampire is, but they're still very powerful when used in the right hands. So, final call, are they meta? In PvP, not really. They're very strong when used properly, but there are a lot of disadvantages to using them. They're more fun than they are effective, but you can burst a player down very, very quickly when using it properly. So in small PvP, very good. But in open world Cyrodiil, when you're 1v10 or you're trying to help group 20v20, Werewolf isn't going to do that much. So it's going to really pull it away from the meta. In PvE, the only real places where Werewolf is semi-effective is 4-man dungeons, where mobs can be feared. Mobs can be set off balance much more readily. And everything deals with burst rather than sustain. A boss has 5 million health versus 50 million health. So those things are much, much different. So a fight's going to last 1-2 minutes instead of 5 to 7 minutes. So the big issues of Werewolf in PvE are dependent. All right, if we're dealing with burst, Werewolf's fun. It's great. If we're dealing with sustain, not really. So here I'm just going to demonstrate going into Werewolf Berserker, showing a few interesting ways about how we can increase the efficiency of Werewolf in both PvE and in PvP. So I've found that Werewolves actually scale the best with Nightblades, and that's because a lot of our buffs will persist through if we use them properly. So entering Werewolf form means I can only use Werewolf abilities. However, if I activate buffs and debuffs such as ground AoEs before entering Werewolf, they will not disappear. So what I'm going to do here is do debuffs and then enter Werewolf to show that I can retain them. So let's activate Focus, this, Trap Beast, and now let's enter Werewolf. Now I can activate all of my buffs, and I have a 4k weapon damage bonus, and then I can do just like basic rotation stuff. See how easy it is to weave my spammable. The other added thing about Werewolf that we can make use of is our heavy attacks. So heavy attacks restore a lot of stam. So let's show what they look like. The heavy attack does damage, and then it looks like it has 2 effects, but If we attack immediately after, we'll also gain something. So watch what I do here. I heavy attack, and then I light attack. And see how it instantly happens and increases the attack speed of my light attacks for a little bit. So again, heavy attack, and then instantly light attacking, and see how I get that massive burst of damage when I'm light attacking right after a heavy attack. So earlier when I was talking about how werewolves have to heavy attack for stand management, but it isn't the end of the world, that's because their heavy attacks are rewarding. They increase the attack speed of our light attacks and our animations a little bit after to make up for all of that operational loss we've incurred from that 2-second window of charging up a heavy. So this is the stuff that ZeniMax really should focus on, is making it so heavy attacks like that are rewarding. There's gameplay elements that you can make use out of after, where you spend 2 seconds wasting, you could have spent 2 abilities, done 2 weaves and 2 abilities. So you're giving up all of that damage, all of those debuffs or whatever you're doing, in exchange for this one slightly more powerful attack that restores stamina. But when we have stuff like Werewolf, where it increases our attack speed animation, where we can make up a lot of those losses that we put in, that makes me much more incentivized to be like, all right, heavy attacking isn't the end of the world. I can get a DPS boost out of this rather than a loss. So I would love to see more gameplay elements added like that, where heavy attacks rewarded the user. It doesn't have to be attack speed. It doesn't have to be just this generic buff. It could be a multitude of things. It could enable debuffs. It could add a stacking mechanic. It could do tons and tons of different things. The more dynamic and interactive, the better. I love skill-based gameplay that allows the user to interact and find interesting ways to use things rather than just being like, all right, I'm just going to get free damage here. So I'd love for ZeniMax to implement that, and if that became a basic heavy attack thing, more people would do heavy attacks. Less people would complain that heavy attacks suck. So Werewolf, a perfect example of how to make heavy attacks awesome, how to make a rotation feel cool and different, where it's not just like, all right, put on my dots, then spam. It's like, all right, put on my dots, spam, manage buffs, then, okay, resource management time. Now I have to get in some flurry of attacks. I'm making tons and tons of decisions on the fly because of how cool the Werewolf rotation is. But at the same time, just in PvE right now, it's really, really lackluster for a multitude of other reasons. So I would love to see that change. But hopefully you guys saw a little brief window on how to make Werewolf cool, and seen a little bit of the animations to see, all right, is this something I can make use out of? Because it's extremely demanding out of performance of a player. So if you don't have what it takes to do all those crazy animations just yet, maybe hold off or start learning sooner. But that's your choice. Still, Werewolf, lots and lots of fun, but kind of lackluster in the meta PvE, but totally badass in PvP. But that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has helped you decide whether or not to become a werewolf or not, or if you are, how to use it in cool and interesting ways. And then one final note, if you are ever unsatisfied with Werewolf, or you accidentally become afflicted with it, go to the Mages Guild of the final zone. So remember, Banker Eye for DC, although if you're EP or AD, you can still go there. Reaper's March for AD, and then the Rift for EP. And then you go to the Mages Guild in the main town there. So Evermore, we're going to go to the Mages Guild. There's going to be a Priest of Arche. Talk to him, give him 500 gold. He'll clear your werewolf. In Reaper's March, it's going to be in Rawcaw, Mages Guild again. And then in the Rift, it's going to be in Riften at the Mages Guild. So just talk to the Priest of Arche, get yourself cured, and then be a happier person more than likely, because Werewolf it's almost there. There's a lot of cool stuff with it, but it's just not enough. But again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you around. If you've liked the content in this video, consider pledging at my Patreon. The community's interest and support keep me inspired and drive me to continue improving and giving back. Thanks to all my patrons who've already shown their dedication. I truly appreciate it. If you have feedback, drop a comment, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or subscribe to the channel. Other than that, I will see you guys next time.